HPPodcraft.com.
There be those who say that things and places have souls, and there be those who say they have not. I dare not say myself, but I will tell of the street.
Oh boy.
You know, I was thinking of streets, and I was thinking of houses and yards, and I live in an apartment, which I like, but I envy people that have yards. One, because I'd like to get a dog, but also because if I had one, I would take the story out there in the backyard and shoot it in the freaking head.
Sir, who are you?
Who is this person spewing this invective? I am Chad Fifer.
Well, Chad, I'm Chris Lackey, and I am shocked. No, I'm not. I'm not shocked in the slightest. But it's not just Chad and I this week.
That's right.
We've got a guest host. We have a guest host on the show this week. And
there be those who say that white people have soul. There be those that say they do not. I don't want to say myself, but I will introduce Matt Burriesci.
Hello.
Matt is the executive director of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs at George Mason University. He's also a published author who has dabbled in the Lovecraft genre, I believe.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
And he is our friend.
And he's a guy who knows Lovecraft.
Yes. Hello, Matt.
Hello. How are you guys?
We are good.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Where are we talking to you at? From?
I'm in Virginia. I'm in Northern Virginia, right outside D.C.
Delicious Virginia.
We're using the internet to our advantage right now.
The wonders of technology.
I've got a colander on my head with all kinds of wires coming out of it.
Oh no, the dream machine.
So
this story's pretty horrible.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Well, let's before we give any commentary here. I think we need to give it. We need to put it out there, and we need to look at it.
All right,
and then we'll.
Yeah. So, and the nice thing about this story is whatever our feelings are about it. It is kind of H.P. Lovecraft's quick little synopsis of American history. And because of that, I thought it would be a good opportunity to discuss maybe Lovecraft's larger historical relevance.
Okay, great.
Men of strength and honor fashioned that street, good, valiant men of our blood, who had come from the blessed isles across the sea. At first it was but a path, trodden by bearers of water from the woodland spring to the cluster of houses by the beach. Then, as more men came to the growing cluster of houses and looked about for places to dwell, they built cabins along the north side, cabins of stout oaken logs with masonry on the side toward the forest, for many Indians lurked there with fire arrows. And in a few years more, men built cabins on the south side of the street.
That's the birth of the street there.
Basically, men came from the Isle, which I assume is England, even though a lot of people that came from Europe weren't necessarily from England. In fact, the Puritans, which I think settled a lot of the area, were Dutch.
Yeah, Portuguese and Spanish and.
Mm-hmm. Lovecraft describes grave men in conical hats who lived there with bonneted wives and sober children.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Puritans.
We're talking about the Puritans.
Yeah, I believe that's what he's talking about. Colonial, puritanical New England, and you know, they were good people because they had come from dear old England.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting to me about this whole story is that it is sort of very classical in the sense that it's Lovecraft's Four Ages of Man, like an ancient Grecian description of the development of the country. There was a great golden age, and then all of a sudden it slowly got corrupted and more corrupted as we go forward.
Right. Part of that corruption is, of course, the slaughter of the indigenous people of this continent, which Lovecraft dispatches that little piece of history in a sentence.
There was war, and thereafter no more Indians troubled the street.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what's awesome is this is the glory period of history when the colonials came and killed the indigenous people. This is when things were great. This is before the corruption set in. You know, this is the golden age.
Yeah, during this golden age, the town turned from just this sort of ramshackle collection of cabins to an actual city, and everyone built some pretty sweet houses.
One by one, the cabins gave place to houses. Simple, beautiful houses of brick and wood, with stone steps and iron railings and fan lights over the doors. No flimsy creations with these houses, for they were made to serve many a generation.
Right, so there was an age where things were better and people were good and decent, basically, and they were sturdy, good people, right?
That's exactly what Lovecraft's telling us right now.
and these houses We'll serve them for many a generation and serve them in some peculiar ways, perhaps, later in the story.
We'll find out.
Yeah. But in the meantime, we move on to the three-cornered hats and small swords and the lace and periwigs.
Oh, delicious snowy periwigs.
Yeah. This is sort of, I guess, the pre-Revolutionary War period that Lovecraft describes.
Yes.
He talks about the street and the trees and the oaks and the maples, and he loves those rose gardens.
Mm-hmm.
And tall beavers.
Yes. Oh, God,
tall beavers.
You know, we had so many more tall beavers before the immigrants showed up and screwed up the beaver population for everybody.
But then the revolution happens, right?
Then the revolution happens. That's right. The young men of the street go off to war. Some never come back.
Yeah, and then he mentions this because the flag changes after this point. Yeah. The stars and stripes are created, and now there are. Oh God!
I'm still laughing about the denizens with their walking sticks, tall beavers, and cropped heads. What does that mean exactly?
What is a tall beaver anyway? Are you referring to like a code or something there, or?
I have no idea.
Maybe they all kept tall beavers as pets.
I don't think so. It's hard. I tried to do a search on tall beaver, and I came up.
Probably came up with some interesting stuff.
Boy, I don't want to speak of it ever again.
The search engine results which shall not be named. I just imagine that what he's intimating is that some swarthy, short European beavers showed up, intermingled with these tall, stately beavers.
And soiled the bloodline.
Ugh, now we just have these, mulatto beavers running around. We don't know where they're from. Well, they begin to industrialize this city. And people show up from elsewhere, but it still kind of retains its English purity.
Then came days of evil, when many who had known the street of old knew it no more, and many knew it who had not known it before.
Oh, that's the worst thing.
So lame.
Yeah.
That's a lame sentence.
Well, that's when things get bad.
Things are starting to get bad before that, though, because he's saying that, it's just like in when he's saying that they tore open the earth and put strange pipes in or whatever.
Yeah.
It sort of sounds like Ovid there, where Ovid talks about men started to become evil when they started digging in the earth and for mines and ores and stuff like that.
Sure, it's a typical fear of scientific advancement, and
right, yeah. It's with scientific advancement comes change, and people are afraid of change.
Right, yeah, and industrialization in general, not something that pleases this guy, because he liked it better when we were communing with nature.
Yeah.
Somebody had actually commented on one of our other podcasts that we shouldn't be judging Lovecraft necessarily by the morals of our own time.
That's something, yes.
And I tend to agree with a lot of Yankees at the time he was writing might have felt the same way, but this story's ridiculous. I mean, it's hard not.
I know it's hard. Let's just push through.
Sure. Okay.
Let's push through, and
then the people who show up, they have unpleasing faces. They have these coarse accents, and the houses start falling into decay as they move into them. Right?
Yeah, basically people from other places, immigrants. Yeah. Immigrants are coming in and destroying it like a vile virus, infecting the body of blessed New England.
Yeah.
But then something good happens, the Civil War.
Exactly. Then the men march off to the Civil War. Some don't come back. Well, it is a good thing, right, Matt? Because they feel a stir of pride.
Right, pride is because they wore blue, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing in Lovecraft. Is that he is proud that this was part of the Union, at least.
Yeah, they're part of the North.
He's a Northerner, a Yankee.
The Civil War happens. Some men go off, some don't come back, and then
new kinds of faces appeared in the street, swarthy, sinister faces with furtive eyes and odd features, whose owners spoke unfamiliar words and placed signs in known and unknown characters upon most of the musty houses.
Yeah.
Oh no, pushcarts are crowding the gutters. It's bad.
Yeah.
Sorted.
That's bad.
There's an undefinable stench settled over the place, which I'm assuming is just like pierogies or something.
There's some of that Italian food.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, I can't identify. What is that? Is that a cream sauce?
But then something good happens. World War I.
Exactly. Yay! We jump into the Great War.
Great excitement once came to the street. War and revolution were raging across the seas. A dynasty had collapsed, and its degenerate subjects were flocking with dubious intent to the western land.
So he's talking about the Bolshevik Revolution that happened at the conclusion of the Great
1917, War. Yeah.
And because of that, and possibly the falling of the empire that we referenced before, there's a lot of people from that portion of Europe who are starting to come to our beautiful western land.
Not good.
Not good. And they want to do some conspiring, these guys.
They're hell-bent on it, actually.
Right. And well, so we had a great victory in the war, and most of our young men returned.
Those who had lacked something lacked it no longer. Yet did fear and hatred and ignorance still brood over the street, for many had stayed behind, and many strangers had come from distant places to the ancient houses.
Yeah, and then we get into what they're doing when they're here, right? They're forming...
They hang out at Piotrovich's bakery.
And nothing good can be happening there.
Oh, no. He doesn't understand that foreign glazing technology.
The squalid Rifkin School of Modern Economics.
Yikes.
The Circle Social Club and the Liberty Cafe.
A bit of irony there.
Yeah. Oh, it's ironic.
But, they're all those places, but...
The heart of that plotting was in the street, whose crumbling houses teemed with alien makers of discord, and echoed with the plans and speeches of those who yearned for the appointed day of blood, flame, and crime.
So these are terrorists.
Yeah, they're terrorists. One of the things I wondered about in this story is what exactly were they going to do? Does he say actually? I mean, they're going to destroy America, but how are they going to?
Their plan is I think they're going to bomb America. They're going to set up bombs and destroy cities and generally bring anarchy.
Basically, the whole country. They're just going to bring it down.
Well, I guess Boston.
He's talking about a terrorist plot.
Right.
He says that the military, they can't really figure out what's going on. What they do know is that some kind of plot is hatching and that it's going to launch on the 4th of July.
Yeah.
So he's doing an episode of 24 right now. Everybody knows something's going to happen. Nobody knows what.
And it's going to come from Petrovich's bakery.
Oh, get a man on there.
The doom that came from the bakery.
And the law can't do much about this plotting. They just put everybody on orange alert. They've got Bauer out there. They've got, the cops, the military. They just know something. It's planned for July 4th. And
the rumor now spread widely that these houses contained the leaders of a vast band of terrorists who on a designated day were to launch an orgy of slaughter for the extermination of America and of all the fine old traditions which the street had loved.
Sons of bitches.
That's such good Bush language too, because they're not just here to exterminate America. It's the traditions they want to come after. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not only who we are, but who we've always been.
That's right.
That's ridiculous.
They're gonna Lovecraft's they're gonna take away our periwigs
and our tall beavers.
That's how the terrorists will win. I love that the terrorists are plotting over hidden wires. They've got all kinds of code language. It really is like an episode of 24,
It is like a 24. Now he talks this. Well, hold on. I'm looking at the text here. He talks about the blue coats are going to defend, but then the olive coats show up.
What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, well, I can explain that to you. Okay. The blue coats are police.
Yeah,
and the police.
But they're in armor.
Well, they have. Okay, I'm just going to make some sense of this because you can't make any sense of this unless you don't. There was a police strike that happened in October of 1919.
Oh, that's what this is based
Yes.
on. Okay.
And so Lovecraft wrote this. This is a quote from him. The Boston police mutiny of last year is what prompted that attempt. The magnitude and significance of such an act appalled me. Last fall, it was grimly impressive to see Boston without bluecoats and to watch the musket-bearing state guardsmen patrolling the streets as though military occupation were in force.
So there's some kind of police strike. I thought maybe the cops were in on the deal. So
yeah, I know. How would you know this from this story? Like, what the hell's going on? It doesn't.
Well, I assume that the military guys were in town.
Right.
All I know is that they can't figure anything out.
And yet the men in olive drab will always remember that night and will speak of the street as they tell of it to their grandchildren. For many of them were sent there toward morning on a mission unlike that which they had expected. It was known that this nest of anarchy was old, and that the houses were tottering from the ravages of the years and the storms and the worms. Yet was the happening of that summer night a surprise because of its very queer uniformity. It was indeed an exceedingly singular happening, though after all a simple one. For without warning, in one of the small hours beyond midnight, all the ravages of the years and the storms and the worms came to a tremendous climax. And after the crash, there was nothing left standing in the street save 2 ancient chimneys and part of a stout brick wall. Nor did anything that had been alive come alive from the ruins.
The street has its revenge.
The street falls apart, This is what I was confused when I read it, and I read it a few times. Now, did the National Guardsmen just level this city?
No.
That's what I thought at first.
I thought the buildings collapsed on them.
Yeah, they just all the buildings just collapse on everybody, and that's it. Like, just magically.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. Ugh.
Is that your interpretation, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, there's a theme in here that I think is pretty interesting in Lovecraft's work, which, first of all, is obsession with the purity, or not the purity, but just his obsession with the past. Mm-hmm. And in a story like this, where the street is gradually corrupted by immigration and everything, ancient powers are eventually unleashed and destroy the corrupt presence or something, which happens in this. It happened in Doom Came to Sarnath, too.
You're right.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that the terrorists were in those houses plotting, and the street itself was finally so sick of these non-Westerners or these non-Americans screwing up their street that they collapsed on them and killed them.
Non-Anglo-Saxons.
Right. And then a wandering poet, who always seemed to come around whenever there's a crime scene. Now he said he saw something a little different. He kind of doffs his beret and leans over to a guy next to him and says, "I'll tell you that what I saw when the houses were collapsed. I saw it was as if I saw the ghostly images of the old houses there." And Lovecraft says, "Now we all know we can't trust poets." But he said he smelled roses in full bloom and he saw the ghost houses.
Yes, the houses that were once theirs, not of the Native Americans, mind you.
No.
No, of
the pretty ones.
The pretty ones.
The good ones.
The good ones.
It is kind of satisfying that the houses collapsed on terrorists.
Yeah, that's all right.
In some way, but oh boy, the ghost houses, man.
And then Lovecraft wraps it all up by repeating the first sentence at the end of it, and that is the end.
Thank God.
Oh.
What do you guys think? Did you like this story?
This is the worst Lovecraft story I've ever read in my whole life. Wow. I was embarrassed while I was reading this. Like, it really... I felt so bad that I'm doing a podcast about H.P. Lovecraft when I read this, because there's like an egotism in this, in his... he's got racist tendencies. We all know that. It's just this diluted world view that he has, and it seems so petty and little, and it's not written well.
I saw this in Wikipedia. It said, according to Daniel Harms, author of the Encyclopedia Cthulhiana, if someone came up to me and said, "Hey, Daniel, I think H.P. Lovecraft was a wordy, over-sentimental bigot whose stories don't make much sense," this would be the last story I would hand to him to convince him otherwise.
But in his defense, the Bolshevik Revolution must have been a pretty traumatic experience in Americans' lives. I mean, basically what he's saying is our ideals are going to trump their ideals, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Even if it's supernatural.
Well, so no, maybe we need to examine that a little more, because we do have quite a bit of distance on what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
It must have been frightening. I mean, sort of like in the 50s when the Russians had Sputnik, everybody flipped out.
Yeah, they thought the Russians were going to colonize the moon. And
to see this other form of government rise up, I mean, this is kind of the beginning of the communist menace.
It's definitely the beginning of the Red Menace. And I think that there was a lot of fear that this was going to spread all over the world. And there remained that fear for the next 100 years, right?
Yeah.
So I think Lovecraft is responding to that. I mean, it's sort of a jingoistic piece in a way, like our American we can get up and beat those commies kind of thing.
Right. Yay! There's a direct line between this story and Rocky IV.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. No stop-offs. Yeah. This, and then the writer of Rocky IV.
Yeah. What Lovecraft started here, Stallone freaking ended in that boxing ring.
I just want to bring up that this story was unbelievably published. In December of 1920, in an issue of Wolverine Amateur Journal, and unfortunately has nothing to do with Logan or the Weapon X program.
Not that Wolverine.
No.
Although this would make an interesting Wolverine adventure, since he's supposedly ageless.
Yeah, he is ageless. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Does Wolverine show up in any Lovecraft stories? This would have been a perfect one. Maybe he was underneath those houses, slashing through all the support columns with his adamantium claws.
Oh, Chad.
He's the one who foiled this attack.
Chad, Wolverine didn't have adamantium claws until the 70s.
So embarrassed.
That was part of the Weapon X program.
Well,
Jesus.
Let's move on from my lack of knowledge of these things to Matt's wealth of knowledge. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was born right around the same time as some other pretty major American literary figures.
He was. He's writing during the great period of American modernism, which is a literary movement that happens between roughly 1919 and 1935. First of all, I should say I'm not an expert in modernism. I just took a few classes in college with Chad. So,
yeah.
But when he's writing, he's publishing at the same time as the great works of the 20s. So he's, The Great Gatsby, The Wasteland, Ulysses. These are all published as Lovecraft is writing. And Lovecraft is reading them. He's clearly reading them. He's responding to them.
Well, they're his contemporaries, as you said. Fitzgerald and Hemingway were born right around the same time as well.
Right, exactly. So he's about the same age as these great figures that basically dominate English classes for the next 100 years.
So T.S. Eliot, did he read T.S. Eliot? Was that something?
He absolutely read T.S. Eliot because, he refers to T.S. Eliot in The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and he actually writes a parody of Eliot's most famous poem, The Wasteland, which he calls waste paper. He didn't think too much of it, clearly.
Oh, wow. That's great. So we just trashed HPL, and meanwhile he was doing the same thing, trashing T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
And another figure, what's interesting about The Street, he writes The Street in 1919, which is the same year that Sherwood Anderson publishes Winesburg, Ohio. And Lovecraft reads Winesburg, Ohio very soon after its publication, which is kind of strange. And do you mind if I go into this a little bit?
No, please do.
So Winesburg, Ohio is this book of short stories. It's sort of an American version of Dubliners. It's about a small town filled with secrets, okay? And a year after it's published, Lovecraft writes Arthur German, the story, in direct response to Winesburg, Ohio. And he says of Winesburg, Ohio, because I think it's relevant because it really reflects, he's really responding to this modernist. He says, somebody had been harassing me into reading some work of the iconoclastic moderns, these young chaps who pry behind exteriors and unveil nasty hidden motives and secret stigmata. And I had nearly fallen asleep over the tame backstairs gossip of Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. The sainted Sherwood, as you may know, laid bare the dark area which many whited village lives concealed, and it occurred to me that I and my weirder medium could probably devise some secret behind a man's ancestry that would make the worst of Anderson's disclosures sound like the annual report of a Sabbath school.
Oh, wow!
So he basically says, I'm going to write something to make Sherwood Anderson look like a pussy.
Which was Arthur Germain, right? Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so his response to Winesburg, Ohio is really interesting because the Miskatonic Valley, it's Miskatonic Valley, right? It's not Arkham County and all that. Miskatonic Valley is directly in response to Winesburg, Ohio. I mean, he creates this universe basically populated with crazy shit that happens, and Sherwood Anderson maybe somebody might get accused of child molestation, but in Lovecraft's Valley, somebody's building an ancient space monster in the barn. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff.
Right, I love that.
Right.
Lovecraft's is really different because, first of all, it's got the supernatural, and second of all, it's populated, he opens it for business. He lets other writers come in and work on it. You know what I mean? He says, fill it up with whatever you want, which is really interesting. I mean, I think it's the first time that ever happens, but I'm not sure. I can't think of another example.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. So his version of Winesburg, Ohio, he doesn't, nobody else was writing in Sherwood Anderson's community.
Right. That was closed. I mean, Philip Roth has a story later that's set in Winesburg, Ohio, I think, but it's, basically just a nod. It's not like what Lovecraft's doing where he's saying, write whatever you want and just set it in my universe,
Yeah, I think that you said something about it that I thought was funny. We talked about this previously. You said it was sort of like open source literature.
It really is, because he really does give it away. He has no pride of ownership over it, which is kind of, it's pretty magnanimous of him, really.
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting how Lovecraft, reads these modernists and the things that they're doing or the things that they think are horrible or bad are nothing compared to the perspective that Lovecraft has. It's kind of this cosmic-ism, this sort of this universal view that humanity is insignificant. All of our little petty squabbles mean nothing.
Right.
Yet they're writing about this little stuff that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's that kind of noir idea that everybody's got a dirty secret and everybody's kind of bent and wrong. Mm-hmm. But Lovecraft takes it that step further and says it's not just us as individuals. The whole race has these dirty secrets. The whole planet has these dirty underground things down there.
All right,
It's like this cosmic almost filthiness that's down there.
What's interesting to me about that also is that he really takes the modernists really they're claiming to be so revolutionary in all this business. And first of all, it's interesting that Lovecraft's reading them because this is not stuff that this is not stuff that everybody's reading. Nobody's going around reading The Wasteland. You know what I mean? Like,
right. Well, it seems like that when we studied it in class. Like this was something that everybody had on their coffee table or something.
Yeah, but it's not. you know? And Lovecraft is reading them as they're being published, which is also interesting. The one thing that he does that the modernists don't do, you look at someone like Joyce or Faulkner or T.S. Eliot, they're obsessed with Jesus Christ. I mean, there is Jesus Christ in those works, Mm-hmm. But Lovecraft, he takes his fiction outside Judeo-Christian universe, mm-hmm. and it's a very classical idea, actually. He's saying to know the gods is to invite madness. If you try to learn about the gods, you're going to go insane.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very Greco-Roman concept which the modernists are trying to get away from.
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's very true.
Absolutely.
Well, when I first Chad was the first one to give me a book of Lovecraft stories, and I got it when I was studying American modernism, I remember the professor telling me how revolutionary what all these people were doing was, and I was reading The Shadow over Innsmouth, and I was thinking, boy, these guys are pussies. Like Lovecraft is, there's no Jesus. There's Jesus in James Joyce. There's Jesus in Winesburg, Ohio, but there's no Jesus in Lovecraft's fiction. Things aren't going to work out. Jesus is never coming back, which is really fascinating. It's a really different kind of idea.
Now, what did your professor at the time think of Lovecraft, or did he even? Because I know a lot of people don't consider Lovecraft even legitimate.
Oh no, a lot of them don't. I have the pleasure of working with a lot of people in the academy. A lot of the people, in universities just sort of look down on Lovecraft as if he is a minor, insignificant science fiction writer from 1920, but I think he's much more influential than that.
I agree with you, and I think that somebody should probably do a podcast to discuss this. Despite the fact that, this week's episode, The Street, is, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the worst thing that Lovecraft has ever written, that he is important.
Well, I mean, clearly one of his big accomplishments is the blend of science fiction and horror that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Exactly.
I mean, that's new, and it does exist somewhat in Shelley and Frankenstein.
Well, I would say that's straight up science fiction. I don't think there's any supernatural mysticism to it at all.
What, in Frankenstein?
Yeah.
Well,
he's raising the dead.
Yeah, it's a blend of horror and science fiction, though. Maybe there's no supernatural, but...
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Lovecraft, it seems like, to me, and of course maybe I'm wrong about this, but Lovecraft is one of the first guys that takes myth and brings it into science. The point that the supernatural that exists out there isn't really supernatural, it's just a science that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. And I think, he's one of the first guys that is really writing about those types of things. From Beyond, which is coming up, that's one of those where it really is about using technology to supersede that supernatural, to get better, the man is being able to, through technology and his understanding of the universe, be able to control it.
Yeah, whereas his central argument is that's crazy. You're never going to be able to control it, and it's right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then once you get there, you're gonna regret that you went to that place.
Right, exactly.
Raymond Chandler?
Yep, Raymond Chandler's writing around the same time as Lovecraft, and he's giving birth to noir. And so, Lovecraft and Chandler are kind of fascinating figures in American fiction because they're kind of below this modernist movement, making huge contributions that are probably, basically everything you see on TV is owing to these guys, I think. I mean, in Lost or...
Sure. It's far more impactful to pop entertainment what Chandler and Lovecraft did than perhaps what T.S. Eliot or any of the expatriates in Paris were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a big claim, but...
I'm making it right now. What, I'm scared?
I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
But, those people had a big influence on Lovecraft. I mean, T.S. Eliot, even though he makes fun of T.S. Eliot, you can see the change in diction that happens in The Wasteland. The Wasteland is this technical poem with all this modern fancy verse, and then interspersed with it are these other languages, ancient languages, and then all of a sudden there's vernacular. So then when you look at a story like Innsmouth and you have this Gothic prose interspersed with the vernacular of the townspeople, and then there's ancient Greek and Latin phrases associated with the Necronomicon, yes. I think that's Eliot's influence on Lovecraft, even though Lovecraft makes fun of him.
Right,
yeah, that's a solid argument.
Now, Chandler and Lovecraft, they both wrote some essays about their genres.
Well, they're both seminal figures in that sense, too, because both of them write groundbreaking essays on their particular genres. Chandler writes The Simple Art of Murder. Lovecraft writes Supernatural Horror and Literature, which is a great essay, actually.
Yeah, it is.
Both of them are arguing for the legitimacy of their genres at the time they're writing. They're saying these are legitimate American art forms. And it's interesting that Poe created both of them. Edgar Allan Poe creates both of them.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's true. He had the detective story in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and he certainly did plenty of horrors, semi-sci-fi.
Pretty awesome.
Well, so I guess we could say that modernism and these writers that were contemporaries of Lovecraft, they were kind of building a little street of their own by which we're all traveling now. As we, it's true because, it really it was a fundamental shift in literature. And, a few weeks ago we talked about the statement of Randolph Carter and how jarring it was, and we actually just kind of touched on this a second ago, but how jarring it was you read Lovecraft's very antiquated prose, and then when we started to get dialogue, it was in the vernacular of the time. Beat it, get out of here. This kind of stuff. Most of the modernists and these writers started making people sound more like people sound, making people live more like people live.
Right.
Yeah.
And that definitely that is how we digest entertainment now. We don't like things that are too detached from reality.
Yeah, exactly.
And if it's something that's genre, we want to have it a basis in our humanity. We want to see the main character brush their teeth, right?
Right. Hemingway's got a big role in that. Hemingway brings in the vernacular in a way that no other writers do. And people like Lovecraft are, they're inevitably influenced by that new shocking diction that people use.
Mm-hmm. And do you have anything else in the story, Chris?
I don't have anything else. I just want to thank Matt for being a part of this and for giving us this great insights, stuff I've never really thought about before.
And for putting up with us, because this is the first time we've done a caller on the show.
Yeah.
We experienced a few technical difficulties. But, man, thank you so much. And we're definitely going to have you on a few more times.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank Andrew Lehman for once again providing some of our readings.
The magnificent Andrew Lehman.
Makes my heart cry.
Well, I am Chris Lackey.
I'm Chad Fifer.
I'm Matt Burriesci.
And this has been the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
HPPodcraft.com.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Oh, I didn't fucking say. Hold on.
Oh yes. Next week we're going to do 2 stories.
Yeah, we're going to do a little double feature. It's going to be Poetry and the Gods.
Yes.
And Cellophane.
Cellophane?
Cellophane. I don't know. How do you say this word, Matt? How do you say the word cellophane? Is it cellophane? Cellophase?
I don't even know that. What do you cellophase?
Cellophais is the name of the story.
I don't know.
I'm gonna guess it's either cellophane, which is probably how Lovecraft would say it.
Yeah.
Or what I like, cellophase. Sounds like sell your face to somebody. That creeps me out.
It's like the sequel to Face Off.
Yeah.
What do you do when your face is off? You sell a face.
Yeah. I'm going to assume that story is about selling faces, but we'll find out if I'm correct or incorrect next week.
HPPodcraft.com.